So good afternoon, and thank you to everybody who is signing on right now. We're going to give folks a couple more minutes before we get started, and looking forward to the discussion. Good afternoon again, and thanks to everybody who is signing on right now. We're going to give folks about 2 more minutes, and then we will get started. Good afternoon once more. We're going to give folks just about 1 more minute to get signed on, and then we will get started. Thank you. Okay, good afternoon and welcome everyone to today's webinar version of Governing Principles. We've got 4 amazing resource experts joining us today, and we're really excited to get this discussion going. My name is Patrick Sims. I'm the Director of Policy and Research with the Hunt Institute, and we appreciate everybody taking the time to join us here on Zoom and all of those who have joined us on Facebook as well. We are really excited to get your questions and would love to hear from you. So please do make sure you use the Q&A feature if you're on Zoom to chat in any questions, and we'll get to as many as we can. For those of you on Facebook Live or on Zoom as well, please feel free to interact on Twitter and use the hashtag #GovPrinciples that you'll see on your screen right now. We'll try to pull in those questions as well and appreciate you sharing out the experience as well, any comments that you have. We're really excited for today's discussion in particular. It's a very timely and critical topic, thinking about how to improve schools during this time of the pandemic, where we already had a tough job ahead of us, and then the pandemic made this task all the more difficult. Fortunately, we have leaders across the country who are focused on this and doing a lot of great work and great things, and we have 4 of those leaders with us today. I'd like to thank everyone for joining us. In particular, I'd just like to note two of our Hunt Cane Leadership Fellows have joined us, so Lieutenant Governor Pamela Evett and Senator Mike Johnston. Thank you so much for being part of our program broadly and joining us today. And of course, Hannah Scandera as well, former Secretary of Education. Thank you so much for joining us. And we're very fortunate to have a very capable moderator and resource expert in his own right as well, leading today's discussion. And I'd like to turn it over to him. So Senator Peter Groff, thank you so much. And I'll turn it over to you now.
Patrick, thank you so much. And thanks to the Hunt Institute for this opportunity to moderate this conversation among 3 amazing folks who are doing incredible things for our kids. Let me introduce them first. Senator Johnston is not here, so I'll save that rousing introduction to when he shows up. But first, I want to introduce the Lieutenant Governor of South Carolina, Pamela Evett, elected in 2018. In 2015, she was ranked the number 3 top female entrepreneurs in the country by Inc. magazine. They recognized her ability to grow her business from inception to just 15 years, over $1 billion. Also, we have former Secretary of Education for New Mexico, Hannah Scandera. She served as the secretary in the land of enchantment for 7 years. She is now currently the CEO of Mile High Strategies division of the Daniels Fund. She was also undersecretary in California, deputy commissioner in Florida, and also deputy chief of staff and senior advisor in George W. Bush's administration, U.S. Department of Education, I would suspect under Margaret Spellings, and probably had one of those fancy offices on the 7th floor of a building that I used to work in. We want to start off with just opening remarks. And Lieutenant Governor, we'll start with you, just kind of around how you're working currently in supporting education through this pandemic in your role as Lieutenant Governor.
So thank you, and thank you to Hunt Keene for having me here. It has been a year like I would have never imagined, right? And what everybody's really focusing on, I think in South Carolina as well as all around the country, is education. And how are we getting our kids back in school? What is the impact of kids not being in school, the downsides to learning as opposed to the mental health consequences it's having, and what are we going to see long term? So in South Carolina, the governor and I have been really focused on working with our superintendent of education. In South Carolina, our superintendent is an elected position. And so the governor, it's kind of out of his lane to demand what happens with schools. Our superintendent has let every school district kind of work through their reopening plan and keeping things safe. But the governor and I are very focused on trying to get kids back in the classroom, making sure that they have face-to-face learning, because we believe wholeheartedly that if we can't get kids back and we keep having this interrupted style of learning, we are going to see dropout rates, not just in South Carolina, but around the country, that we are all going to be unhappy with in the years to come. We know that it's important for our children, those younger, learning to read, kindergarten through 3rd grade, to be with an experienced, trained teacher, to be able to learn the vital skills they're going to need through life. And so that's what we have been focusing on, making sure that we have proper PPE for schools so that they can safely reopen. We know that our parents are getting antsy and really want to see that happening all across our state. So we're just working hand in hand with school districts and teachers and education to make sure that we're doing the best thing for our children here in South Carolina.
Senator Groff, I think you seem to be muted.
Yep. Sorry about that. Secretary Scandair, in your current role as CEO of Mile High Strategies, what are you working on to support education of kids? Not only, I think Daniel's fund is in Colorado, but it's a regional fund. So in that regional capacity, what are you doing in your opening 3 minutes?
Thank you, Senator. Great to be here today as well. And so, yes, I'm on the board of the Daniels Fund, and we invest in 4 states, Colorado being our primary, but also New Mexico, Utah, and Wyoming. And through that, we've been able to create a COVID response fund focused across communities and needs, but also specifically around our charter schools and their needs have ramped up in trying to be responsive and innovative in this time, and frankly, on really practical things like our new, protocols for students to come back, what needs to happen from a cleaning perspective, to health and safety standards, et cetera. So we've been really focused on how to support our schools who are working, and I just want to applaud the Lieutenant Governor and her commitment with her governor to bring kids back to school. And yes, we have to be thoughtful, but there is no replacement for being in a classroom with a great teacher and learning. And so just a big believer that how do we support our communities, our teachers, and our families in bringing our kids back to school in the safest and most responsive way, but not losing sight of the value of our kids in classrooms. In addition, I have the privilege of serving as a coach and mentor through Chiefs for Change. So working with a lot of state chiefs and district superintendents, particularly through a Women in Leadership coaching and mentoring program that I helped launch, that is now asking, how do we support our leaders? I mean, this is not an easy time. It is not just a health crisis, right? We're seeing just the convergence of health, economics, culture, and frankly, just a whole host of issues that are colliding. And so how do we think about supporting our leaders in meaningful ways, because they're on the front lines and they're making tough decisions day in and out and day out. And frankly, we all know this because we've all had leadership roles. You're never going to make everybody happy in tough times. And so how do we support our leaders in making the best decisions and knowing full well they're going to feel it. Pain points are going to come from a lot of different spaces and places. Lastly, I serve as the vice chair of our community college system board here in Colorado. And I've had the privilege of supporting our 13 community colleges and thinking about how do we reopen, how do we respond to our students' needs, and frankly, how do we be responsive at a time like this when it comes to upskilling and reskilling and creating a supply and demand alignment between our education and our workforce needs at a time when we've just seen incredible upheaval and great need for jobs, but also great need for the right skill sets for jobs. So really get the pre-K all the way through community college opportunity to see how do we support our different folks on the front lines who are really leading this charge.
Lieutenant Governor, we know you have to go, so you can escape your undisclosed location right now. But I really wanted to have you talk about the great work that South Carolina is doing, recognized on a national level for your school improvement efforts. You've really made an intentional effort to invest state funding in identified areas of priority. So how is South Carolina rethinking how the state supports schools to ensure areas like student mental health supports, teacher compensation can be properly funded in a time when the pandemic really has begun to constrict your budget?
Yes, thank you so much. In South Carolina last year, we were very happy that we did teacher pay increases. We knew the governor recognized that our teacher starting salaries were very low, and we wanted to make sure that we addressed that so that we could get the best and brightest educators here to our state. Before the pandemic hit, we had the General Assembly, the governor, and the entire administration all on board with not only doing another set of teacher pay increases, but also taking a lot of focus into early childhood education. Wanting to make sure that we got out to our rural areas, our areas that were most at need, and had state funded 4K. And we were all in line to do that right when COVID hit. So we have, that is still our intent. We're hoping South Carolina is coming back, and very happy to say that we were in a very good place before COVID hit. We're getting back there quickly. So we feel very hopeful that we'll be able to go back and now put into place a lot of these early childhood education initiatives, which we know and we've seen from other states that have great improvements, that this is the way to really impact our children, is to help them in their earlier years. We also, on the other spectrum, kind of going along with what you said, Hannah, is knowing how vitally important it is for our children and for the companies who invest in South Carolina to have a really robust technical college. I believe, and I know I'm a bit biased, that South Carolina has one of the best technical colleges in the country. We really believe in Team South Carolina here. And, we put our businesses with our technical colleges and colleges to collaborate together to make sure we're creating workforces that will help these students going in to this new era in manufacturing and technology and robotics. The governor and I have always championed the fact that there are great paying jobs that come out of our technical schools. But in order to be able to fill those positions, we had to change the mindset, not so much of our students, but of their parents and grandparents. We found that they were looking at manufacturing in a very old light, right? So re-educating people in general to be very positive and welcoming of our technical schools is something that we're very passionate about here in South Carolina. Because of COVID, brought a lot of things to the forefront. Last year, the governor knew the best way to keep our kids safe was not just putting more school resource officers in our schools, but to make sure we had mental health experts in all of our schools. That together, that would make a safer environment and let parents rest easy when they were at work all day and their children were at school. So we knew that mental health experts, they are hard to find. And so we put in telemental health, especially in our rural areas where we saw we were going to have a problem filling those needs. So, you know, we put that all into play last year. We really got an eye-opening lesson when COVID hit and everything started to go virtual, right? That we needed to look at broadband in our state and give a really hard look at it, because there were many areas that we couldn't have virtual learning because there was no broadband to get there to help teach those children. And so when the money from the CARES Act came in, we worked with our local leaders and our officials on the state level and the House and Senate to make sure that we passed and gave a lot of money out of the CARES Act to be able to get broadband to those hard to reach areas, putting up hotspots. I think this will go hand in hand with the telemental health that the governor was so passionate about from the last legislative season. And so we are making big strides at that, giving more and more money and resources to broadband, because we know we need to be ready for not only what's happening now, but could happen in the future. We know that it's not really funds in South Carolina. In a nutshell that we're worried about, it's teacher retention. We see a lot of teachers leaving the system by their 5th year of teaching. And so what we're trying to do is work with teachers, get their salaries up, and keep them so that we can have teachers that have been around for 10, 15, 20 years. They can use all the experience they've gained to help the students of South Carolina. So that's going to be a big focus for us, is teacher retention and reaching out to get the best quality teachers we can for our state.
You talked a lot about, and this will be the last question because we know you have to go. You talked a lot about the whole child approach, and Dr. Barnett Berry from the University of South Carolina asked about that, but he also asked about kind of school transformation, including community schooling. Do you want to say a bit on that before you go?
So yeah, so you know, in South Carolina, the governor and I believe wholeheartedly in school choice. We feel that that is a really good way to kind of keep expectations driving high, making sure that parents have the control of where they want their children to go to school. I know Senator Scott is very passionate about making sure that a zip code doesn't define your educational future. And so we are trying to make sure that children all around our state have multiple options, whether it be charter or public or private. We have a lot of Christian schools through our state, and we want to make sure that we're giving parents the opportunity to be involved in that education and make sure that they can choose what's right, because we know a one size fits all does not fit every child. I'm a mother of 3. And I can tell you all 3 of my children learned very differently and thrived in different environments. And we need to be able to make sure that we have options for all children so that they can be the best that they can be, so that we can give them all a bright future.
Thank you. Thank you so much for your time. I know your schedule is pretty hectic with what you're doing right now, so we appreciate it. And feel free to sign off when you have to go. Well,
thank you. And, you know, Hunt Keen means a lot to me. I learned so much from my time in DC listening. And so I was so happy I could participate today, and look forward to just all these kind of seminars and idea sharing to come in the future.
Thank you. Again, thank you for your time. Senator Mike Johnston has joined us. He is the 2nd greatest state senator from Senate District 33 in the history of Colorado. The first was a guy who served in the 70s and 80s by the name of Regis Roth, but right there is Mike Johnston. Mike, welcome. before, obviously, you served in the legislature for 8 years, noted education reformer and innovator. Before that, the founding principal, I think, of Mapleton Expeditionary School of the Arts in Thornton, I believe.
Yes.
So we're gonna bring you in, and you can kind of wrap your opening statements as well as kind of around this question. I know that you've been working with school districts and leaders in Colorado on school reopening, and we just heard a lot from the Lieutenant Governor about that. So including the creation of testing systems and a platform for symptom tracing and contact tracing. How has the pandemic, do you think, caused states to rethink what schools need to do to be successful? And how has your time in the Colorado Senate working on ed reform issues really informed your current work?
You bet, Peter. Great to see you, and thanks for having me. What Peter missed was I replaced Peter in the Senate. So really, Peter was the first Senate president from our district and the first African American Senate president in Colorado history. And so I always say to people, I am the new and less improved Peter Groff is the real story. And Peter, as you probably are used to, I have 3 kids in my house here, all doing online school from home at the same time. So if my Zoom gets throttled and I start breaking up, let me know, and I will shut off the camera and just go with audio, which is probably better for folks anyway. But let me know if I start to break up. Yeah, really excited. So honored to join this great panel of leaders. And I am now in my new role. I'm the CEO of a foundation here in Colorado called Gary Community Investments, and our focus is all on low-income kids and their families. And so I want to talk a little bit about what we've done in this context. I'm very impressed by what the Lieutenant Governor shared about South Carolina, but what we saw in Colorado was when the pandemic hit and we had 500,000 Coloradans unemployed and we had 1 million Colorado kids not in school, we were trying to figure out how we were going to be able to put that back together. And we thought the only real effective way to do it, because we knew that academic losses would be profound for our kids. We're now on the brink of seeing the impact, first historic impact of 3 consecutive summer slides. And so you had, normally we talk about the summer slide as the impact it has on low-income kids when the summer happens, and teachers do a great job catching them up from September to May, and the summer hits, and those kids who don't have access to camps and intellectual experiences over the summer, we see the slide that comes from those learning losses over the summer. Well, we had that before summer with the COVID shutdown in the spring. We had it through the summer again to compound that. Now we have a 3rd closure this fall for kids that can't get regular access or high quality access to the online schools. And so there's some projections that say this could set back our effort to close achievement gaps by as much as a decade. And so I think that our belief was we could not be agnostic about school opening. And instead we had to be pragmatic about what is it going to take to open them and make sure they stay open safely. And this became a very political debate about whether or not schools should or shouldn't open. And we think that was the wrong approach. The right approach was what would it take to make sure teachers have the protections that they need to be called back into service the same way that nurses or firefighters have the protections they needed to be called back into service in this kind of crisis. And so we went about building a platform that we've called COVID Check Colorado that we built that's helped schools and colleges we reopened. We reopened in partnership with 20 school districts in Colorado and 10 colleges. We've put almost 200,000 students back to school and in-person learning. And we've done it with an approach that does the 3 simple things we know all employers need, which is 1, regular access to testing. So all of the teachers in our 20 partner districts are getting regular access to COVID testing every 2 weeks right now as a part of their routine asymptomatic screening. I like to say, unless you play for the Denver Nuggets, there's no one in Colorado that gets more testing than our public school teachers. And so we think that kind of VIP status is merited. We link that with the symptom tracking platform so that each day a student and or a teacher can check on a symptom tracker. Do you have a fever? Do you have any symptoms? Have you been exposed? If any of those come up as a yes, we then immediately send those students back or teachers back to one of our testing sites where we can retest them right away. If they answer no, they can obviously return to school safely, and we monitor those. The third is a contact tracing tool, because as we know, what we've seen as the challenge for districts is if you have 1 positive case, and in some states that means 1 positive case means an entire high school has to shut down of 2,000 kids, or it means 5 or 6 teachers all have to be quarantined for 14 days. Well, the former school principal in me knows if you send home 5 of my teachers for 14 days, the entire 6th grade shuts down, or the entire 9th or 10th grade shuts down. And so what the contact tracing does is it helps teachers keep a diary every day of anyone they've been in contact with. So if Peter and I had a meeting for an hour last night in his office as the assistant principal, I would note his name. If Hannah and I were in a grade level meeting yesterday for 45 minutes, I would note that. And that means when you find out, as we have, we've stopped more than 200 outbreaks in schools around the state at this point. When the superintendent gets that information that this teacher is positive, she can instantaneously know who are the 3 or 4 or 5 teachers who may have been directly exposed to her. Who do I have to keep out and get tested tomorrow? Who do I need to get a sub for so I can keep the building operating? And that has been, I think, a tremendous impact for us in helping places stay open. So we think there is a way to both open schools, to do it safely, and to make sure we can get kids back to in-person learning, because we know not just the academic impact, but the social and emotional impacts are dramatic. So it's been.
Mike, you're breaking up.
Colorado a leader in this space be key for us. I think Bill Gates said, I'll stop there and just say, I think that's going to be key for us, because I think, as we know, one of the greatest losses of this COVID crisis could be not just the health outcomes, but the academic losses.
We want to open it up for questions from the folks who are watching or listening. So go ahead and in the Q&A section on your Zoom screen, go ahead and offer some questions. But Madam Secretary, I wanted to bring you in. Mike mentioned kind of the losses that we could potentially see, some of the dramatic learning losses. One of those issues that's really driving conversation around the country as a result of the pandemic is, how do we assess learning both short-term and long-term, which also, of course, informs how we assess school effectiveness and quality. What has the shift to virtual learning revealed about measuring school quality, and what lessons can be drawn from state leaders or for state leaders whose work is to support schools on their improvement plans?
Yeah. Thank you for that question. And I'll just say, Mike, hey, tremendous work in Colorado, and really believe how you presented the reality of the importance of getting back to school was well said. Well said. It's easy to get into political back and forths and lose sight of what our ultimate goal is, to get our kids learning. And to your point, Senator, I think before I dive into that in specifics, one of the things that struck me is we're at this really unique point in time in regards to some of the things Mike mentioned about just, the health and how do we track and how do we know, and all those things to make sure we're meeting kids' needs and families and teachers. And then on the other end of that, and I'm not sure it's on the other end, and simultaneously, there's this opportunity, I think, in a crisis to not let it go to waste. And how do we think about innovation? And I'm going to segue into capturing learning loss or gains. But I do think there's a moment in time here for all of us in education and those who are, impacting and making decisions, to also be really creative and think about how do we, yes, empower parents with more decisions, better decisions, more information, and different solutions than maybe we've seen before. And I say that because the loss of learning, Mike said it, we've had 3 summer slides in a row. That's serious. That's big stuff when it comes to kids and closing gaps. It is very difficult to close a gap when you see that many kind of moments in a row that don't allow you to kind of recover and close. And so I will say, as we think about the assessment and accountability space that so many folks talk about in education, we can't lose sight of innovation in that, because we're in a weird time. And we're going to have to think about creative ways to capture learning and learning loss. But, and I will say this, we can't avoid the opportunity to know how our kids are doing. And there's lots of different opinions around this right now on how do we do that. Do you do it at the beginning as kids were coming back in a diagnostic format? Do we keep our annual assessments at the end of the year so we know how much our kiddos have learned? And here's what I would say. I think we'll see some innovation in this area, and it's high time we see some innovation. But the fundamental reality is we've got to know how our kids are doing. And our parents deserve to know, our teachers deserve to know, and our communities deserve to know. So as we kind of walk back into, you know, a new year in January, and middle of a school year for our kids. We can't lose the mission of knowing how our kids are doing and having creative and innovative solutions on how we are going to close gaps, because they're going to be real. There's no way. If you didn't have internet in the spring, if you were, I mean, New Mexico, when I was living there, you know, so many of our kiddos lived in rural areas. Here in Colorado, as I'm here now, so many of our kids in rural areas. We've done a great job here in Colorado around connectivity, but there are kids who didn't even have the connectivity piece in place first. So that means more learning loss. And so as we look ahead, it's incumbent upon each one of us to hold ourselves as adults accountable for finding creative solutions to know and give parents and students and teachers and communities good information so that we can serve our kids even better. And I really believe that, you know, when you hear the words testing and accountability at a time like we're in, it's kind of like, really? We've got basic needs, and that is true. We have basic needs, but when you can't read, at some point that turns into more basic needs that need to be met. So how do we balance those, but not lose sight of the importance of knowing how our kids are doing and equipping parents and communities with good information to create probably more innovative solutions than ever for our kids to close those gaps.
Let me follow up on that comment, Madam Secretary, and Senator, we'll get you in on this as well. Former West Virginia Governor Bob Wise is with us today, and he said in his experience, there were three kind of recovery stages to disasters or a crisis. First, there's the triage. Second is that transition period. And then third, if fortunate, the ability to actually transform the situation so that it's better than it was before. But in this situation, teachers and school leaders, district officials, state officials are furiously trying to figure out how to adapt their system right now. But then you kind of talk about the ability to do some transformative things later on. At what point, he wants to know, do you ensure that there's the time, the tools, and the thinking to maybe have a reset year for current education systems? Do both of you see that?
Mm. Oh, wow. Governor Wise, great question. I really do believe that that's going to have to be a localized decision because I don't think, you know, I think the Lieutenant Governor said it earlier, all of our kids are unique and our communities are unique. And so it is going to require our leaders to make decisions around, you know, at what point do we shift? When are we able to innovate? When are we just in survival mode? That could be different in different places across our country. I mean, it is now. We're seeing certain communities, they're 100% back to school with all their kids in their classrooms, and others where none are back. And so when you think about solutions and when is it time to hit reset or, you know, kind of reset a year, et cetera, I fundamentally believe we may need more flexibilities at a time like this so that leaders can make the best decisions for their communities, but it'll be a very localized decision based on all this convergence of health, economy, culture, and communities' needs.
Senator Johnston, do you have a comment on that?
Yeah, I'm going to stay on audio now because I'm breaking up, but hopefully this will make it smoother. Let me know, Peter, if you lose me.
Okay.
Great question from Governor Wise, and yeah, it makes me miss having his thoughtful insight around. We need to get him out to Colorado. I mean, my thought on this is, I think this data is going to be more urgent than ever for the purpose of diagnostic understanding, if not necessarily right now for summative understanding. So, I mean, to this point that Hannah was describing, like, we actually have to know how deep the hole is, right? Like, you actually have to know what the score is right now. And so if in fact we've lost 2 years of academic growth by the time we get to this spring, that is critical for us to know, because we have to create the WPA style response to the kind of academic recession that we're going to hit, as well as the economic one right now. Or if somehow teachers did the incredible job of patching together this, you know, makeshift online and at home, and my kid learns as much math this year as he did last year, I would be astonished, but that would be wonderful to know that we actually held serve in some way. So I think it's going to be really critical for us to keep all these data systems on in the spring, even if the process of testing itself is going to be challenging, just so we can get a benchmark of where we are from pre-pandemic times and what it's going to take for us to recover. And frankly, I'm terrified to see the data on how big the achievement gaps and growth gaps have become. Because, Hannah was talking about this, but in Colorado, our data last spring was up to 50% of Latinx students in Colorado do not have access to either wireless or a computer device, which means a full half of Latinx kids could not access any of the remote learning if they were in a remote learning only district. And so if that's the case, we have to assume those gaps are going to be profound, and they might be very different across subgroups. We might find huge drops in Latinx performance because of that achievement gap, because of that access gap. That won't be true for African American students, or vice versa. It could be other subgroups, and to Hannah's point, in different states that are adversely affected. Like what's happening to the Hmong population in Minnesota, I have no idea, but I imagine it looks very different than what's happening to the African American population in Florida. And so I think that will be crucial data for us to have just to be able to plan for how we're going to get out of this.
Both of you mentioned kind of those equity issues and kind of equality issues. We have a question from Democrats for Education Reform in Colorado. The question is, do you think there's political will to make dramatic changes in the way we need to educate our youth moving forward? Where have you seen examples of real political will from elected officials to address issues like systemic racism within our education system and disparities in access to high quality or excellent schools of choice or excellent choices? Mike, why don't we start, Senator Johnson, why don't we start with you on that? And one of the things that you probably experienced when I was in the legislature is, and the secretary mentioned this, that in rural areas, there were broadband issues. In our district, there were broadband issues. And so a lot of times there was really a coalition between urban legislators and rural legislators to try and move an education piece forward. Are you still seeing that in Colorado and other states that you're working in? And then specific to the question from Deefer.
I think there is some effort, indication of that. So right now we move forward a big ballot measure this year in Colorado to fund universal preschool that has a coalition of rural legislators and urban legislators, because we knew it could help backfill cuts to rural education as well as support long-term preschool, similar with our attempt to repeal the Gallagher Amendment, which is cutting schools and small businesses across the state. So there are a handful of places where there are still urban-rural coalitions and bipartisan coalitions on exciting things. But I think the underlying question is a really profound one, and I'll stay off video because I get heated on this one. But I think this is one where the question was, where have we seen political will and why has it not been gathered here? And here is, for me, the most profound example. And I'm as a certified special ed teacher, I'm excited about this. If you look at the way this country has responded to the additional learning needs of students with identified disabilities, it is remarkable, right? The legislation has said, we will provide any amount of resources necessary. And if you look at, and they literally has said, no amount of money is too much. As superintendents know, as Hannah knows, if you have a student that is $1 million student a year because she requires 3 full-time paraprofessionals and a health nurse and a mobilized wheelchair, the district is expected to carry that cost. Now, is that a good policy for districts? Maybe not. And the courts have even interpreted that to say, essentially, yes, we affirm that no amount of money is too much. You have a moral and a legal obligation to get this child whatever her needs are. And when you look at that for a student who is an English language learner, for instance, or a student who might have learning disability, or a student who might come from a family without access to books or without access to home or summer programming, there is no such commitment. And in fact, then the budget sort of trumps any sort of philosophical belief. And for me, that's quite clear. The reason why that is the case is because disability is equally distributed across the entire income spectrum and the entire political spectrum, which is, there are certainly US senators who I'm sure have sons and daughters who have learning disabilities, and congresswomen and congressmen who have sons and daughters or cousins or nephews that have learning disabilities. And that has summoned from them the personal experience and the will to make sure that's met. I do not think there are any U.S. senators who are living below the poverty line, and or who have kids who are living below the poverty line and can't get access to high quality school options. And so I think what we're witnessing is just it is a gap of political will. What I'm hopeful about is this is the most compelling moment in American history I've lived through, where there is a real insurgence about the need for racial justice. And my hope is that, and there's some efforts on this in Colorado around the RISE fund our governor's created, to dedicate a fund just to closing the inequalities that we know existed before COVID and have been made worse by COVID. And so I'm hopeful this is a chance to really push structural change to say, let's look honestly at the way these institutions have been really discriminatory and continue to be, and not accept that for an answer. I think that means overturning things like school finance acts around the country that have been really products of privilege and of political power, not of need. And so I'm hopeful that there's a moment where this is possible, and I hope that legislators and advocacy groups really push now of all times to say we should look at the entire system in ways that we can redirect it towards equitable outcomes.
Madam Secretary, your thoughts on where you've seen some real political will from elected officials around systemic racism and within our education system?
Yeah, I'm hesitating because I'm usually pretty harsh on this and saying that we need more courage, full stop. And I think more than ever, Mike said it, I've never lived through a time like this. And times like these require more courage, not less. I am hopeful that we see that. I would not by any stretch say no one is being courageous, but I also would say I think there's lots of room for more courage right now. How's that and at the end of the day, we've got to see this as a generational issue. We've got to see that we've got to, look at this with the end in mind, which is not the moment of, oh, this is a pain point, but it is the conviction that at the end of the day, this moment in time could define the future for so many.
Right.
And so like I said, I say that with humility, but with a deep conviction, because it's our moment. It is our time as leaders across the country, in our states, in our communities, whatever our role is, everyone has an opportunity to be courageous right now. And it's going to take that in my estimation. It is not we don't have the chance for a one-hit wonder. This has got to be a commitment that goes beyond. It's got to come from the bottom up and the top down. And it's got to stay the course in the midst of a lot of other pressures that are here, and they're real. So I don't say this lightheartedly. I say it with, it's a moment in our history that matters immensely.
Well said. Senator Johnston, we've had a number of questions about how Colorado has approached testing and contact tracing, both for students and staff, specifically in regards to frequency, cost, and then building an infrastructure around that program to sustain those efforts. Can you share just a bit more of what this looks like on the ground in Colorado?
Yeah, you bet. And if anyone wants to learn more, feel free to email me. I can share you our entire structure. My email is I'll put it in the chat, but it's mjohnston@garycommunity.org. So we have done a couple, right now what we're doing is a cadence of testing all teachers every 2 weeks. What we do is we do that as a rolling structure. So if you imagine you're in a high school and you have 100 faculty in your building, we don't test all 100 of those on the 1st of the month and the 15th of the month. You instead test 10 of those a day, every single day, and you ideally distribute those across your building. So every day you're testing 2 people on the 9th grade team, 2 on the 10th grade team, 2 on the 11th grade team, 2 on the 12th grade team, 2 from the East Wing, from the West Wing, whatever it is. So every day you're seeing rolling live data of prevalence of the illness in your building. So if there is an outbreak in the 9th grade team, you're not waiting 2 weeks to see that data, you're getting feedback daily. So that's the case. And then we're also, anytime a student is symptomatic, as one school district told us, they just looked at their data from last year, the number of students in the first month of September who came to the nurse with a condition that would have counted as a COVID symptom, so cough or a fever or shortness of breath, that would have been 7,000 kids in 1 month alone in just one district. And of course, no one wants to be you can't be too cautious in this moment. So we're also allowing any, students at any moment that they're symptomatic or they've been exposed to be immediately testing. We're preparing to roll out in the next month pilots with middle and high schools to actually do regular testing of student populations also every 2 weeks, so that those schools will be able to reopen in person as well. So we're going to be expanding to full surveillance student testing as well. We've been able to, through the philanthropic support and the system we put together, we've been able to offer testing around $10 per test to districts. We've been able to we've done 50,000 tests so far. We've returned them in about 48 hours total. So we're, I think at that volume, I think it's best in market. A lot of tests are $150, $200 a piece. So that cost plus that turnaround time has been critical for districts' ability to open and stay open. And so we've stood up drive-through testing sites. We have 8 drive-through testing sites that in Colorado that run all the way from Boulder down to almost Colorado Springs. So about 70% of the state is within that footprint, and it's about a 15-minute drive from our testing site. You come in, it takes 3 minutes to do a quick nasal swab, and you're out, and you get a text message with your results in about 36 hours. So that's the structure we've set up, and we think we've done some talk with national organizations about using this as a model for the rest of the country to adopt, because we think there's a path to really show that you can open and stay open and do it in a way that provides accessible, affordable, and convenient testing for teachers and students.
Thank you, Senator. Again, if you have questions in our final 10, 15 minutes or so, again, put them in the Q&A function there at the bottom of your screen. Secretary Scandera, with what Mike just said, with kind of the costs now of testing and tracing, how are state budgets being impacted by COVID, and how should policymakers identify funding priorities just in the short term, let alone long term? That's another question and conversation. But just in the short term, what should they be looking at? Yeah.
You might have noticed I'm not a sugar coater, so I'll just lay it out there.
Yeah, I noticed that.
Yeah. This is tough. I actually became secretary when we were coming off the 2008 recession. And, there's no other way to say it. Tough decisions will have to be made. And I think the biggest, the starting point to me is asking, what are our basic and greatest needs, and then what works. And I'm not popular for saying this very often, but I'll say it. We invest in things sometimes that don't work. And I'll use New Mexico as an example, since I lived that live. 43% of the state's budget went to K-12 education. And we had to do some incredible cuts coming off the 2008 recession. We're an oil and gas state as well, so it was complicated. And I would just say we're in a way more complicated time now than then. And so it's incumbent upon, and this is where courage and data and reality come together, right? It's almost impossible to please everyone when you're making decisions about money. And so what you do want to be able to do is say, we can't do it all. What are our biggest priorities where we get the biggest bang for the buck? For us, for example, at the time that I was getting to make these decisions, for better and for worse, we knew our kids couldn't read. I mean, New Mexico was one of the lowest states in the nation when it came to reading. And we said, no matter, come hell or high water, we're going to focus on early learning through 3rd grade, because we're believing that is going to create exponential results for our kids. Well, I would say today, once again, we're going to have to ask not just what's good, what would we like to do, but where are we going to see exponential results for our kids and our communities, because we cannot do it all. And I mean, we would have said we weren't doing it all before. And we're just, it's compounded now. So it is, and the more effective we are at building bridges and community, alliances and rural and urban settings and walking across the aisle right now, the more effective we'll be at implementing those instead of fighting through the priority lists when it comes. But I would say the biggest charge right now is, what are our big bets? And that might include, and Mike mentioned this, Governor Polis putting together a RISE fund using CARE dollars to invest in innovation for closing gaps. So you could say, man, we're tight on money and we're going to try and create innovative solutions in our communities around gaps. And I'd say yes, because you know what, that's a big bet. That is a big bet, because what we're doing pre-COVID, some of it worked, some of it didn't. We want to make a big bet that we're going to get more bang for buck post-COVID with the right investments. But there's no sugarcoating the reality we are in, which means tough decisions, courageous decisions, and the more effective we are at walking together in this, the bigger the bang of the buck.
Senator Johnston, one of the things I mention when I lecture to young people about leadership is one of the frustrating things for me when I was in office is we had a tendency to legislate to the headline and not really to the story. We had this real lack of courage, to mention the secretary's comments, to kind of look around the corner. We now have an opportunity, I think, with COVID and this pandemic to look around the corner on education policy. What would you tell legislators to do and other policymakers to do at this moment? How would you leverage this time to come up with real kind of innovative policies around school improvement and even choice? You're on mute still.
Yep. Can you hear me? Just want to make, I was
Yes.
breaking up a bit. Can you hear me now?
Yes.
Great. It's a great question, Peter. And I think, yeah, I got into this business because of the courage of people like you who actually led at whatever the costs were and kind of were we're fearless, I would say, advocates for kids. I think we're going to need more of those for sure. So I would say people who are motivated by that should run for office. I think the question is like what has happened in the last year as we've faced a world we never thought was conceivable, both with the pandemic and with the Americans kind of awakening to the racial injustice that has been present for so long. And I think we've also witnessed a radicalization of political ideology, I would say, from both sides. I won't get too political about that, but certainly what it means is there's a set of solutions on both sides people never thought were on the table that are now on the table. And that's worrisome in some areas of debate. It's actually an opportunity in others, which is to say things that would have been impossible before, like saying, let's reconsider the entire funding structure for how we fund public schools. Let's reconsider the entire expectation for who gets the resources that they need. And is public education really just go up to age 18? Does public education really end at 3 o'clock every day? Does it end on June 1st every summer? What does it look like to provide comprehensive supports to kids in a differentiated way based on their backgrounds and their needs? And what does it mean to look at both the economic recession we're going to face and the crisis around budgets, and to look at the historic discrimination we're facing and what the impact of that has been, and how do you then build new with an eye on both? And what I think in this moment is a realization that the gaps that we have were not created by race neutral policies. I think that's a truth we're all confronting. I think that opens the question of whether or not we're going to be able to close them with race neutral policies. I think that means we have to be much more aggressive in how we think about what the supports are and benefits that could come around that. So I think people ought to be looking really carefully at where are we going to invest the money, what outcomes will we get for it, and what ways can we develop, what innovations can we develop that will deliver high quality outcomes at potentially lower the same cost with the real mind towards equity. So I think those are the most interesting questions for me, and the willingness to rethink all of the old systems in places like higher ed. Like, what is the model going to be for getting a degree out of higher ed or for getting job skills? And if it's not going to be a traditional 4-year degree, how do we make sure that everyone has access to them? So I think COVID crisis may have accelerated our need to face these systemic changes, and that's an opportunity for big ideas and for real political courage. I think people like Hunt Keen will help us unearth some of what the big ideas are, and then we'll need the political leaders with courage to help advance them.
Secretary, we have an election coming up in a couple of days, apparently, I'm told. If all of the governors who win on November 3rd or 4th or 5th or whenever the votes are counted, came to you and said, I want to completely restructure funding in our state. assessments in our state, and I want you to remove systemic barriers. What would you tell them? What would be the plan that you would give them?
Nobody gave me that question in advance, Senator.
Oh, I figured we have like 2 minutes left, so before we have to go back to Patrick. So.
Like, boom, drop the mic. So I'll start with some ideas, but I would just say that's a big question, but a super important one. So when it comes to starting points around funding, you know, and Mike alluded to this and went there. Let's just go with, so far we fund based on seat time, how long your rear end has been in your chair. There's nothing that tells us that's actually where we get, you know, the most learning in the sense of just, you know, being in a chair. And I think, you know, there's an opportunity to rethink how do we know that kids are actually learning, and think more about a competency-based system and an outcomes-based system, if you will, not just a time system. So I certainly would, and like, that's just an example, like the systems we've set up, I often say this, why are we surprised by the results we get? The systems are actually set up and designed to produce what we're getting. And so until we address, you know, how we think about the amazing work that our teachers do and the teacher pay that should be commensurate with excellent teaching, we're, you know, the Lieutenant Governor said it earlier, we're going to struggle with retention, right? So across the board, I would be asking the question, what is this system in funding incentivize? Is it, you know, is it completion or is it competency? And I think that we're rife with opportunities in education to ask, what have we put forward as the model that is delivering, like I said, exactly what it's intended to do, and it's not great for kids. And you know, how would we think about more empowerment to parents and students around what serves them best, instead of just, hey, we know best, and therefore here's the solution. How do we begin to think about funding as a way of equipping our communities to actually make decisions in the best interest of their kids, versus saying, this is of course the best way for you? Well, that's a funding mechanism, right? That is, right. We're serving it up and saying we want one thing, but at the end of the day, we're going to have to ask tough questions about what we're incentivizing and what we actually believe, and marry those two things. So I think the starting point is, and you said it, funding tells the story pretty well about where we are. And so starting there and asking, what do we really want, and how could funding incentivize that? Because that often is the motivation.
Thank you so much. And I will turn it back over to Patrick Sims. But first, I want to thank Lieutenant Governor Pamela Everett from South Carolina, the former Secretary of Education in New Mexico, Hannah Scandera, and the outstanding former state senator from Colorado, Mike Johnston. Patrick, thank you for the time.
Thank you. And again, thank you so much to both Secretary Scandera and Senator Johnston for joining us today. We had a lot of big questions. Luckily, we had big thinkers. And Senator Groff, thank you so much for your moderation. I was chatting with one of my colleagues saying, sometimes I moderate these, but I think we might need to figure out how to contract you for all of these. So thank you so much for that. For those of you who did join us today and want to go back and rewatch, we have recorded this. So we'll be posting a recap and a recording of this, so you can go back and catch anything you may have missed. We also know there were a number of questions we weren't able to get to. We'll try to get to some of those on Twitter, so keep an eye out there on our hashtag, and we will try to get some more thoughts there for you, because I know there's a lot of interest in this discussion. We have a number of webinars coming up, in particular one next Tuesday, our next one on the Black student debt crisis. So please look at our website, hunt-institute.org/upcoming webinars, and join us for more discussions. Again, big thank you to all of our panelists today. It was a great discussion and I really enjoyed it. Thank you all.
Thank you.